So we're going to continue with the church history, and before we start, I just want to do a brief recap. We talked about last time about the division of Constantine's empire, how he divided among three of his sons. Julian the Apostate, how he returned to paganism, and then after him, Theodosius, and he was the last ruler that ruled the whole Roman Empire. And then it was divided to east and west permanently from then on. And we're going to continue to talk about the fall of Rome. And the fall of Rome, it didn't happen all at once. It happened in stages. So the first stage, if you see the black line dividing the purple, whatever color you want to call that, and the German area, and that line is the Rhine River, and that is where the barbarian Germanic tribes, they invaded when the water froze over in the winter. The barbarian, they entered the Roman territory and took over certain areas. And some think that they may have crossed over also because they were oppressed on the east side by the Huns. So they're running away from them, and at the same time, they're plundering the Roman areas. After that, a couple of years later, in Britain, there was a revolt, and the Brits, they decided to rebel, and they took over, the pagan Brits took over Britain again, and the Romans decided that it was not worth their time or their effort or their money to take that over because they didn't really care about those Brits anyways and that land, so they just didn't attempt to reconquer it, and then the Roman armies that were in there asked for help, and the Romans said pretty much, we're not going to come, we cannot reach Britain, so we're not going to try to. So Britain was taken over by the barbarians as well. And then in 476, that's when Odoacer, he was a barbarian king. He comes over, kills the last Roman emperor, Romulus, and becomes the king of Italy. And this is the final fall of Rome, and the western half of Rome is finally over, and now it's run by barbarians. So it's no longer the Roman Empire anymore. And the east continues to exist, and it goes by the name of Byzantine Empire. So the one in the orange color, that's the east, and that is the Byzantine Empire. And there's no longer the West Roman Empire. And so since there's no Western emperor, he was considered to be the head of the church or the one controlling the church. Now there was no emperor to be in charge of the church. And the Bishop of Rome, also called the Pope, he was viewed by the people now as the head of the church. And he also involved himself in political treaties with the barbarians, so he was also increased in political affairs, and therefore the people viewed him as the leader of the church, and his supremacy grew. And to continue with this, I'm going to talk about pretty much a little precursor. We're heading into medieval era, and this, when the Roman Empire fell in the West, that's when the medieval era started in the West. But before that, I want to talk a little bit more about monasticism and monks, because they were very prominent in the medieval area and had a huge role, and I would think it's very helpful for us to understand what is a monk, why they're monks, and what do they do. So to begin, we're going to talk about a form of monasticism. So before we start on that, I'm going to talk a little brief recap. Monasticism was put into heat or viewed negatively during the Reformation. When the Protestants looked at it in a negative way, they were attacked by Calvin, by Luther. Luther used to be a monk. And so a lot of negativity is viewed upon monasticism because they read them through the lens of those reformers. And misconceptions arose as well. And one of those was they're living in those monasteries to save their souls. But in reality, most of the monks, they did this for the devotion of God. They did this to be closer to God. And also, when you look at the people and the prophets of the Old Testament, how they abstained from things, how they were Nazarenes, for example, in Leviticus, or if you look at Elijah, how he was in the deserts and he was fed by ravens, or you look at John the Baptist, that was the main figure that the monks looked up to, how before he came into the ministry in the Jordan area, he spent his time, alone with God in the wilderness. So they wanted to also follow the footsteps of these great men and practice asceticism, which is to abstain from material things. And the word monk, it means to be alone. So what the monks did, they lived alone in isolation from the world that is around them. And so before, if you remember from the Roman Empire, how they used to persecute the Christians, and to be martyred was considered very great honor. It was considered to be very honorable and a great sacrifice. But after Constantine took over, there's no such thing as martyrdom because, Christianity became the main Roman religion. So there's no more martyrdom, and so the people turned more to monasticism. They viewed as monks as being sacrificial, giving up their life to God. So this was kind of like changed from martyrdom into monasticism. And it was focused more on serving Christ and others, which will produce suffering for them, for example, when they abstained from these things, and they tried to achieve this type of suffering for the glory of God. And there's two forms of monasticism. The first is eremitical monasticism, which is when you're a hermit, and another one is Cenobite monasticism. This is the one that we're most accustomed to, which is going to monasteries, and you see the monks, and singing their songs and stuff like that. But we're going to start with eremitical monasticism, and this is hermit style, entire isolation. When you go into deserts, on the edge of a desert, so you can withdraw there and to be with God and draw closer to God. So St. Anthony of Egypt, he was not the first one to do this, but he was definitely the most popular one of these type of monks. And he was a Greek-speaking Christian that wanted to imitate John the Baptist and Jesus as Jesus was in the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights. So he wanted to imitate that, and he wanted to be sacrificial, living sacrificially to God. And his history is written by Athanasius. If you remember, he is the one that was in the first ecumenical council that spoke against Arius. This is also the book that Augustine was reading before his conversion in the garden. So it was very influential. And so St. Anthony, he wanted to live a life completely devoted to God and not wrapped in this world. And he was, so his background is he was raised in a rich family. His parents died and left him and his little sister as orphans. And as he was thinking about the apostles, how they left everything and to follow Jesus, he also heard in the church that if you want to be perfect, he was talking to a rich young ruler, he said, if you want to be perfect, go and sell all that you have and give to the poor and come and follow me and you'll have treasures in heaven. So he decided that he's going to act on that, and he gave away 300 acres, which he got inherited from his parents, sold his possessions, and gave to the poor. And then he left a little bit to his sister so she could live on something too. Then he went to church again, and he heard the words, do not be anxious about tomorrow. This is when Jesus was talking to his disciples. Do not be anxious about tomorrow. So he decided, okay, I'm going to fully give everything to God. So he gave every last bit of his money away and committed his sister to known and faithful virgins to take care of her, and he went to live as a hermit. So he moved to the edge of a desert, a couple miles away from Alexandria, and he lived there for about 13 years. And he was almost always fasting, and the way he got food is when pilgrims came to him and brought him food. So he kind of depended on them. And they visited him because they wanted his advice, because he was considered wise. So he was there, being sanctified or coming closer to God, and they came there to get his advice and brought him food as well. And as he was there, as tradition tells us, he said that he had temptations of phantom woman who tried to seduce him. So he had these imaginations of women trying to seduce him, and then animals and beasts of the wilderness trying to scare him. And we're also told that the devil physically beat St. Anthony severely. So he almost died there. So he decided that he needs to withdraw, take a little break, and he goes back to civilized life for a time to regain his strength. And then he decided the second time he's going to go to an abandoned Roman fort, and he lived there for 20 years. And it is said that he locked himself in there and lived there for 20 years, and pilgrims, again, they came to him, brought him food, and he would give them advice. Also at that time, he says that he struggles with the devil, and when the devil comes again to him, he says, he claims to the devil that he has no power over him because he is Christ. And it is said that because of his saying, because of his faith, God's favor was upon him, and Satan was forced to flee. So this time he was victorious. That's what the tradition says. And so the earlier monks, they saw in a particular light when somebody gives up and becomes sacrificial, decides to fast, is very great honor. Now, also remember that they didn't look at these things as a negative thing. They didn't think that marriage is inherently evil. They didn't look at property as inherently evil. And even Christians at that time, they were expected to fast for certain periods of time. So monks was pretty much kind of like the very increased version of what Christians were supposed to do in the first place. So in the early church, priests were allowed to marry. They were allowed to own property. All Christians were responsible for fasting for certain periods of time. And also, the monks, they decided to abstain from these things, not because of its evil, but because it is additional sacrifice and sanctification before God. And then next time, we're going to go into the Sabinic monasticism and how it grew and became very popular in the Catholic Church.